Hey everyone, in this video, I want to show how you can run Cortex on Linux. So most of the demos that I've done of Cortex have been on Windows. The reason for that is just because when Cortex started out, we were specifically an archive tool for Cherwell. And Cherwell, both client and server side, were Windows applications. So Windows was a very familiar environment to most of the people who were using Cortex. And it just made sense to show everything in the context of running as a Windows application. Now, there are a few different things that have happened in the year and a half since we started selling Cortex. One is we started doing more with Cortex, and it's not really tied to Windows anymore. We now support multiple database engines like Postgres, which can run perfectly fine on Linux. In fact, I think most people probably do run it on Linux and not on Windows. Um, in fact, you can import your Cherwell data from Microsoft SQL Server into Postgres with a little utility that we've built, uh, and run your entire Cherwell archive on completely open source software. Well, except for Cortex, but everything else being Linux and Postgres and that sort of thing. The other thing that's happened is there's been a push away from Microsoft technologies. And I think part of that is a couple different things: data privacy regulations, the push into AI, and the question around what is happening to data. Is it being used to train LLMs, that sort of thing? There's been a push away from using proprietary uh, infrastructure, in particular in Europe. At one point, there was a a headline that uh, European countries and municipalities and states had been moving to Linux. I think that was later corrected to specifically say moving from Office to LibreOffice. But either way, there's a movement from proprietary software into open source software because there's a lot more flexibility there. Because these organizations have a little more control over what happens to their data. And even if I don't think any of those systems, those open source systems, have an AI component, they're not sending anything off to an LLM. But let's say those maintainers decided that yes, they did want to um, integrate LLMs and have it be on by default. Well, the fact that the projects are open source means that anyone who wants to use it can just go in, add a switch, or just remove that feature entirely and have their own effectively custom version of the open source software, which is good for organizations that have strict privacy requirements, strict security requirements, strict data governance requirements. I think in Europe it's called data sovereignty now. Um, but either way, that's a thing that's happening. And from the very beginning, we have supported Linux as a deployment target for Cortex. It wasn't widely used, again, because Thermal data was mostly on Windows. But now that we're doing things like automation platform and our email monitor, there's nothing tying you specifically to Windows, and Cortex will work totally fine on Linux. So in today's demo, I want to show getting Cortex up and running on Linux, uh, and Linux being a choose your own adventure sort of environment. There are a lot of things that you can do with Linux, with the Linux version of Cortex. I'm going to show you the way that I would recommend you set it up, but you're under no obligation to do it exactly the same way that I do. So I'm going to switch over to our the demo machine, or the machine I used for the demo last week, where I showed we have a little utility that you can use to import a ZAR. It's also the same utility you can use to migrate a database from Microsoft SQL Server to Postgres. Um, but here's my home directory on this machine, and you can see I have the Cortex Linux version, and I've already extracted it. So um, at this point, it's pretty much installed. Like there's nothing else really to do. I could just go into this folder and just run Cortex. And of course, I don't have it configured, so it's going to bomb. It's going to say, I don't know how to connect to a database. Okay. That's fine. Um, So let's set things up the way I would set them up. I could just go into app settings.json and go setting my connection strings and that sort of thing. But what happens if I want to upgrade Cortex? Well, now I have to move the app settings.json around, um, maybe delete this installed version and create a new installed version. Oh, and also this version, this extracted tar file is in my home directory. That's probably not the best place for Cortex to be living. So let's go see what folders we have on the root of the system. Well, we've got opt. I like opt. I like opt for um, like custom installed uh, software. So if we ls opt, you can see that's where like Microsoft SQL Server installs. So I do have SQL Server installed on this machine. Um, and it kind of keeps it separate from, slash bin, slash user slash bin, those sorts of things. So let's just go ahead and create a folder called slash opt slash cortex. And then we'll go cd over there. Opt, opt, cortex. And of course, there's nothing there because we just created the directory. Let's start by copying, yeah, that. You can see I've done this before I recorded the video. Um, I'm going to copy all of those files into an, I'm actually not going to copy them directly into this folder. I'm going to create a subfolder with the version number in it so that when I download, 2.2, I can install it side by side, and then when I'm ready, I can switch over. That'll become a little bit more clear as I do some of the other things that I'm about to do. So, oh yeah, I have to be root because uh, I didn't give my own user access to this directory. So there we go. And we can see now we have Cortex v2.1.2 there. I'm also going to create a config directory. And again, I have to be root. And what I'm going to do is, yeah, actually that command. So this config directory is going to hold the configuration that is common to whatever version of Cortex I might install. Now, the app settings JSON file does get updated some from version to version, but typically we make backwards compatible changes. So if you're missing a setting that, let's say we added a setting in 2.2, if you don't have that in your app settings JSON, 2.2 isn't going to totally bomb. At the same time, I do recommend that you go through the new app settings JSON and just make sure that there's nothing that we added that looks like it might be interesting to you. We usually try to call that out in demo videos or documentation or something like that, release notes, that sort of thing. So with that, let's copy the app settings in there, and then yeah, let's do that and get everything ready to go. Um, So what do I need? I need to set authentication type equals none. I'm going to leave the licensing alone. Um, we'll run it in unlicensed mode, but I need a connection string, right? Okay, so how do I get a connection string? Let's just use the connection string from the demo I did last week. So I think that, no, not that command. Let's Cortex util. That one looks good. Yeah, here we go. So we've got a connection string here. Let me make sure I copy the whole thing. Copy that. And we'll paste that right there. Now, I didn't need, there is an option that I'll need here that I didn't need for the command that I pulled this from, which is multiple active result sets equals true. All right. Now, again, we have config directory, we have our Cortex directory. Now, how do we get Cortex to reference the config directory? Um, because, of course, Cortex is going to look for this app settings JSON, right? Well, let's, yes, I'm going to run the command that it's suggesting, but first, let's just move app settings.json out of the way just for a second. Um, I always hesitate to delete things. Let's move app settings JSON to app settings JSON dot orig. And now we'll do that. And basically what this is doing, this command is making a symbolic link from app settings.json in the current directory where Cortex, the binaries are, to the version in our config directory, right? And of course we have to be root in order to do that, right? And now we should be able to run Cortex. And if I did everything correctly, it will just spin up just fine. And it looks like it did. Obviously, it's warning me that it's unlicensed, so result sets will be limited to 10 rows. Um, that's expected, right? I didn't put a license key in. If you see an error, actually, I think it shows up as a warning that it can't write to something called Cortex settings. Don't worry about that. It's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. Early on in Cortex's kind of booting sequence, it looks for some settings. If you have settings, it uses them. If you don't have settings, it uses some reasonable defaults. Um, but shortly thereafter, it creates that table and populates it with default settings. So there's kind of a chicken and egg situation going on there that we haven't quite resolved. If it shows up as a warning, you're totally fine. If it shows up as an error, that's a problem. Contact us and we'll help you work through that. Um, Now, this will run the web server on port 5000, but by default, it runs it on localhost. If I were running on my local machine, I could just pull up localhost colon 5000 in a browser and I'd be able to see it. But this is a VM. I'm not on the same machine, so I can't actually see it. In production, I would recommend that you do something like reverse proxy with Nginx or something like that, so that uh, there's an actual HTTP server uh, responding to client connections. And you can even do things like SSL termination there, and then reverse proxying back to the actual Cortex application. The Cortex application should not be directly interfacing with clients. It's not really designed to do that. The web service, the web application layer provided by ASP.NET is not really intended to be a full web application. It's intended to have a reverse proxy or a web application firewall or another sort of ingress, to use the Kubernetes terminology, in front of it. So how, how do I actually show this to you? And in fact, if you put an ingress, on a separate machine, if you put your reverse proxy on a separate machine, you would do the same sort of thing. And it is actually this example here that I have. So ASP.NET Core underscore URLs tells Cortex what URLs, URL or URLs to listen on. And in this case, I'm saying listen on all addresses, not just the loopback address, not just localhost. This is the same as 0.0.0.0 in IPv4 land, and brackets colon colon in IPv6 land, which um, we'll we'll see evidence of in a minute. And then port 5000. If you wanted to listen on a different port, you could do that. You could change this to 8080 if you want to. Um, you could change this to 80 if you are running as root. I do not recommend doing that. In general, services should not be running as root. They should be running as their own service users. So likewise, you could make this run as www data. And you could certainly enforce that through something like a systemd service definition or something like that. But for simplicity and for time's sake, I'm just going to run this like this. And then when it pops up, which you can see it's successful, it shows the same output as before. We can see rejoining the server. And if I refresh that, we can see that is in fact the system that I was pulling up. We can go over to browse. We can look at incidents. We can browse around. Uh, right there we go. There's our system. It's pulling up data. This is running on Linux. This is running just as a process, and you can see we've got some warnings here, but uh, you can see this is the system that I'm running from. So if I end that process, uh, obviously this goes away, and I cannot no longer connect. Again, for production, I would recommend setting it up behind a reverse proxy. I would recommend using something like a systemd configuration so that when the machine starts up, it automatically runs Cortex. You can manage it through the normal systemd start, stop, status commands, those sorts of things. This was just a very simple, high-level demo of getting Cortex running on Linux and configuring it. Again, some of the locations of files and directories, those are my personal preference. You can do whatever you would like to do. Um, Maybe at some point we'll put together a script that actually does this sort of installation for Linux um, for you. It kind of provides a guided, recommended installation. Let us know what you would like. Leave a comment down below if you want to see something like that. If you have any questions, come join us in the Cortex users group or in our Discord server, um, or leave a comment down below. With that, I'll see you in the next one, and go download Cortex and run it on your Linux machines. Thanks again.